The winter of '88. They called it the school children's blizzard back east, but out here in the untamed Wyoming territory. It had 100 other names, none of them kind. For Abigail Thorne, it was the season the world turned white, froze solid, and then shattered. It was the season the snow took everything, her laughter, her love, her hope. Left her a ghost in a frozen wasteland. She thought she was the last soul breathing in that endless white hell. But then from the heart of the swirling snow, a figure emerged. Silent, watching. A warrior carved from the very ice that had claimed her life, offering a choice she never thought she'd have again, perish in the cold or fight for the embers of what remained. The wind, a mournful beast, had been clawing at the cabin for 3 days. Abigail Thorne, a woman whose spirit was usually as bright as the prairie sunflowers, found herself watching the sky with a furrowed brow. Beside her, her husband, Thomas, a man built as sturdy as the oak trees he felled, was mending a harness, his calloused hands deft and sure. Little 6-year-old Sammy was on the floor by the hearth, meticulously arranging twigs into a corral for his imaginary ponies. Their homestead, a modest but proud cabin, nestled in a shallow dip of the rolling Wyoming plains, was their dream, carved into the wilderness. They'd staked their claim under the Homestead Act 2 years prior, poured their sweat and savings into the land, turning sod and raising timbers against the backdrop of the distant jagged peaks of the Laramie Range. Life was hard, unforgiving, even. But it was theirs. The soil was stubborn, but yielded enough to sustain them, and the small herd of cattle Thomas had bartered for was their promise of a future. "Sky's got a mean look to it, Abby." Thomas said, his voice a low rumble that usually soothed her. Today it carried an edge of concern. Old Man Hemlock, down at the supply post in Laramie, warned this winter might be a bad one. Said the Crow were moving their winter camps further south than usual. They know the signs. Abigail nodded, pulling her shawl tighter. "We've got plenty of wood stacked, Thomas, and the root cellar's full. We'll be fine." She tried to sound more confident than she felt. The snow had started an hour ago, small, hesitant flakes. Now they were fat-heavy and coming down with a relentless determination, driven by a wind that seemed to whisper warnings. Sammy looked up, his bright blue eyes, so like his father's, wide with a child's wonder. "Is Father Christmas coming early, Mama?" Abigail managed a smile, ruffling his hair. "Not just yet, little bear. This is just Old Man Winter, reminding us he's still king out here." But as dusk bled into an early oppressive night, the playful dance of snowflakes transformed into a blinding, suffocating torrent. The wind escalated from a mournful howl to a furious shriek, rattling the window panes and sending icy drafts snaking through the chinks in the log walls, despite their careful mudding. Thomas went out one last time to check on the livestock in the lean-to, fighting his way back against a wall of white. "It's a bad one, Abby," he gasped, shaking snow from his hat and coat, his beard already crusted with ice. "Coming down like the devil himself is shaking it from the heavens. The cattle are huddled, but if this keeps up—" He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew the danger. Livestock, their most valuable asset, beyond the land itself, could be buried frozen or scattered by such a storm. They ate their meager supper of stew and cornbread in uneasy silence, the roar of the blizzard a constant oppressive presence. Sammy, sensing the tension, was subdued. Abigail tucked him into his small cot, humming a lullaby that was nearly drowned out by the wind's fury. "Get some sleep, love," Thomas said, his arm around her, as they stood by the small window, peering out into an impenetrable wall of swirling white. We might have a long day ahead of us. But sleep was elusive for Abigail. The cabin, usually a haven of warmth and security, felt fragile, besieged. The wind sounded like 1,000 hungry wolves clawing at their door, and the snow, the beautiful, innocent snow, felt like a malevolent entity intent on burying them, erasing them from the face of the earth. She prayed for morning, prayed for the storm to break, prayed for the safety of her small family. The dawn, when it finally arrived, was not a reprieve, but a revelation of nature's unbridled fury. The world outside their small window was an abstract canvas of white, the familiar landmarks of their homestead. The well, the fence line, even the small rise where Sammy loved to play. Utterly obliterated, swallowed by drifts that piled high against the cabin walls, reaching halfway up the solitary window. The wind hadn't lessened. If anything, it shrieked with a more maniacal intensity, driving the snow with such force that it seemed to penetrate the very logs of their home. "The lean-to," Thomas said, his voice grim, his face etched with worry as he peered through a small section of the window he'd managed to clear of frost. "I can barely see the roofline. The cattle." Abigail knew what he was thinking. Their small herd, Bess Clara and the young bull Brutus, was their future. Losing them would be a blow they might not recover from. "You can't go out there, Thomas. It's a white hell. You'll be lost in seconds." His jaw was set. "If they're buried, they'll suffocate. If the roof collapses..." "I have to try, Abby. We have to try." Sammy, awake now and bundled in every spare blanket, they had watched them with wide, frightened eyes. The usual morning cheer was gone, replaced by an oppressive, cold dread. "At least wait," Abigail pleaded. "Wait for a lull. It can't keep this up forever." But the blizzard seemed to mock her words. It raged on a relentless, timeless entity. Hours passed. The cabin grew colder. The firewood, though plentiful, seemed to offer little contest to the Arctic chill seeping in from every direction. Thomas paced a caged animal, his gaze constantly returning to the obscured world outside. Around what Abigail guessed was mid-morning, for the sun was a forgotten memory, Thomas made his decision. The winds shifted a little. "I think there's a slight dip in the snowfall. It's now or never, Abby. If I can just clear the snow from their breathing spaces, reinforce the roof a bit." He bundled himself in every layer he possessed, woolens, oilskins, a thick scarf wrapped around his face, leaving only his determined eyes visible. He took the sturdiest shovel and a length of rope. "I'll tie one end to the door latch. I won't go further than the rope allows. If I'm not back in an hour, or if the storm worsens, significantly you..." He paused, his eyes meeting hers full of a desperate love. "You stay inside. Keep Sammy safe. Promise me." "Thomas, no." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, freezing almost instantly on her lashes as a draft hit her. "It's too dangerous. We have no choice," he said softly, kissing her hard, a quick, desperate act of affection. He then knelt by Sammy. "Be brave, little bear. Look after your mama." He hugged the boy tightly. Before Abigail could protest further, he unlatched the door. The blizzard surged in a ravenous beast of wind and ice, momentarily blinding them, stealing their breath. Then Thomas was gone. A dark figure, swallowed by the swirling white maelstrom, the rope snaking out behind him. Abigail slammed the door shut, leaning against it, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She and Sammy huddled together, listening to the storm's symphony of destruction, every howl of the wind sounding like a premonition. An hour stretched into an eternity. She kept her gaze fixed on the door, on the taut rope that was Thomas's lifeline. Then, with a sickening lurch, the rope went slack. "Thomas," she whispered, then shouted, "Thomas!" Only the wind answered its voice, now seeming to hold a note of cruel mockery. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Abigail. "Sammy, stay here. Don't move from the hearth." Ignoring her own safety. Ignoring Thomas's last instruction, she pulled on her own worn coat and boots, wrapped a shawl around her head and mouth, and grabbed the smaller kindling axe. She couldn't tie a rope to herself. There was nothing strong enough inside to anchor it to that would allow her to reach far. She cracked open the door. The white fury that greeted her was staggering. It was like stepping into a void where all senses were assaulted and then obliterated. "Thomas!" She screamed into the wind, the sound snatched away and lost. She followed the path the now slack rope had taken, one hand trailing along the cabin wall for as long as she could. The snow was waist-deep in places, the wind a physical force trying to rip her from her feet. She could see nothing, only feel the biting cold and the sting of ice particles against her exposed skin. Then a darker shape in the white. A mound. And the end of the rope frayed and snapped, whipping uselessly in the wind. She scrambled, dug frantically with her mittened hands. First she found his hat, then a shoulder. He was face down in a drift near the collapsed remains of the lean-to. The structure had given way entirely, a tomb of splintered wood and heavy snow. There was no sign of the cattle, only the devastating wreckage. "Thomas!" She clawed the snow from his face. His skin was icy, his lips blue. There was a dark stain on the snow near his temple, a bloody gash where a falling beam must have struck him. His eyes were closed, dusted with snowflakes. "No. No, Thomas, please." She shook him, her voice a raw, broken sob. "Wake up. Please wake up." He didn't move. He didn't breathe. The warmth that had always radiated from him was gone, extinguished by the cruel, indifferent storm. A different kind of cold one that had nothing to do with the temperature seized Abigail. It was the chill of utter despair of a world irrevocably broken. She didn't know how long she knelt there, cradling his frozen head, her own body slowly succumbing to the numbing cold, her screams lost in the blizzard's indifferent roar. The thought of Sammy alone in the cabin finally pierced her shock-induced paralysis. Sammy. She had to get back to Sammy. With strength born of a mother's primal need, she tried to drag Thomas's body, but he was too heavy, the snow too deep. Defeated, heartbroken, she pressed her lips to his frozen forehead, one last time. "I love you," she whispered the words tearing from her soul. "I'll come back for you. I promise." Fighting her way back to the cabin was a journey through hell. Disoriented, blinded by tears and snow, she nearly missed it, a darker patch in the white expanse. When she finally stumbled through the door, she was a spectre of ice and grief. Sammy rushed to her, his small face pale with fear. "Mama, where's Papa?" The storm finally broke on the third day after Thomas's death. It didn't depart with grace, but rather sulked away, leaving behind a world transformed, sculpted into alien shapes of white under a bruised and weary sky. The silence it left in its wake was profound, almost as terrifying as its previous fury. It was a silence that amplified the emptiness in Abigail's heart, the hollowness in the small cabin that now felt like a tomb. For those first 2 days of the storm's lingering presence, Abigail had moved in a trance, a state of numbed shock. Her world had shrunk to the immediate primal needs of survival. Keeping the fire alive, melting snow for water rationing, their dwindling food for herself and Sammy. Sammy, bless his innocent heart, was mostly quiet, his playfulness extinguished. He'd ask for Papa, his small voice laced with confusion, and Abigail would offer vague reassurances, her own voice strained, unable to yet form the words that would shatter his world as hers had been. The cold was a constant companion seeping into their bones. With Thomas gone, the task of chopping more wood from the snow-drifted pile outside became a monumental effort for Abigail, her grief-stricken body weak, her hands clumsy. Each swing of the axe was a testament to her agony. When the sun finally dared to show its face weak and watery, it illuminated a landscape of breathtaking desolation. Drifts higher than a man blanketed everything. The path Thomas had taken to the lean-to was a deep, snow-filled trench, his form now completely buried under the fresh fall. The lean-to itself was a mere suggestion of wreckage beneath a massive mound. The first priority, an agonizing one, was Thomas. She couldn't leave him out there. Armed with the shovel, Abigail began to dig. Sammy watched from the doorway, a small, forlorn figure wrapped in blankets, his eyes huge and uncomprehending. It took hours. The snow was heavy, compacted. Her muscles screamed, her back ached, but she pushed on, driven by a desperate, sorrowful love. When she finally reached him, his body was frozen solid, a statue of the vibrant man he had been. The gash on his temple was dark against his pallid skin. With tears freezing on her cheeks, she struggled inch by painstaking inch to drag him back to the cabin. She couldn't bring him inside, not fully. She cleared a space on the small covered porch area they'd built, laying him there, covering him with a canvas sheet. It was a poor makeshift resting place, but it was the best she could do. The days that followed were a blur of grief and hardship. Sammy finally understood in the way a child does that Papa wasn't just out in the snow, that he wasn't coming back. His quiet sorrow was almost more unbearable to Abigail than outright wailing would have been. He'd sit for hours staring at the spot on the porch, his small wooden ponies forgotten. Their food supplies, meant for a harsh winter, but for 3 people, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. The root cellar, located a short distance from the cabin, was buried under a colossal drift. It took Abigail another full day of back-breaking labor to tunnel her way to its entrance. The relief of finding the preserved vegetables and salted meat untouched was immense, a tiny flicker of hope in the overwhelming darkness. But the cattle were gone. Their future, their security lay frozen under tons of snow and wreckage. The nearest neighbor was miles away, an impossible distance in these conditions. Laramie, the closest town with a marshal or any semblance of authority, might as well have been on the moon. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. The silence of the plains, once a comfort, now pressed in on Abigail. Every creak of the cabin, every sigh of the wind through the eaves sounded like a footstep, a whisper. At night, she'd lie awake, clutching Sammy close, imagining shadows moving outside the frosted window. Was it just the wind playing tricks with the snowdrifts? Or was there someone out there? The wilderness, which she had once embraced as a partner in their dream, now felt like a predator watching, waiting. One evening, as a pale moon cast long, eerie shadows across the snow, she saw tracks. Not animal tracks, or at least not entirely. They were large, deep as if made by a man wearing snowshoes, but broader, somehow different. They circled the cabin at a distance, never coming too close to the door or window. before disappearing back into the undulating white. A week after the great storm had passed, when the sun had begun to melt the surface of the immense drifts into a blinding, crusty glare, a new shadow fell across Abigail's ravaged homestead. It arrived in the form of 3 riders, dark figures, stark against the unending white. Abigail spotted them from a distance, her heart lurching. She quickly ushered a bewildered Sammy inside, barricaded the door as best she could, and took down Thomas's Colt Peacemaker, her hands trembling as she checked the load. The lead rider was a man she recognized with a sinking feeling, Silas Blackwood. He was a rancher from the north, a man with a reputation for ruthlessness and an insatiable hunger for land. He owned a vast spread that bordered their smaller claim, and Thomas had mentioned once with a frown that Blackwood had made a dismissive comment about sodbusters scratching at his rightful grazing. Blackwood was a broad, imposing man, his face weathered and hard, his eyes like chips of obsidian. He was flanked by 2 hard-looking men, their expressions cold and unreadable rifles resting easy in their saddle scabbards. They reined in their horses a respectful distance from the cabin, though their very presence felt like a violation. Blackwood dismounted his heavy boots, crunching on the crusted snow. "Mrs. Thorne," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the crisp air. It was a voice accustomed to command smooth, but with an underlying rasp. "Silas Blackwood. I was in the area checking on my own losses from this accursed blizzard. Saw your chimney smoke. Came to see if you folks were all right." Abigail, peering through a tiny gap she'd made in the window covering, didn't trust him for a second. His concern sounded hollow, rehearsed, but to show outright hostility might be foolish. She unbarred the door, slowly stepping out onto the porch, the heavy Colt held at her side, partially concealed by her skirt. She stood near the canvas-covered form of her husband. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. We were hit hard." Blackwood's gaze flickered to the ominous shape on the porch, then back to her face. He removed his hat, a gesture that seemed more calculated than respectful. "I heard some folks didn't make it. I am truly sorry for your troubles, ma'am." Is that your husband, Thomas?" Abigail nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "The storm, the lean-to collapsed." "A tragedy," Blackwood said, shaking his head slowly. "A damn tragedy. He was a hard worker, Thomas, a good man. This land, it can be cruel to good men." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "And even crueler to a woman on her own with a child." His eyes swept over the homestead, lingering on the wreckage of the lean-to, the towering snowdrifts, the small, vulnerable cabin. It wasn't a look of sympathy, Abigail realized, but of assessment, like a vulture circling. "It's a hard thing, Mrs. Thorne," he continued, his tone shifting, becoming more businesslike. "Trying to manage a claim like this, especially now with your livestock gone, I presume." "We'll manage," Abigail said, her chin lifting. Blackwood chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Spirit, I admire that. But spirit doesn't rebuild a herd, or clear 10-foot drifts, or keep the wolves, both 4-legged and 2-legged, from the door when winter truly bites down. And there's more winter to come, make no mistake." He took a step closer. "Look, Mrs. Thorne, I won't beat around the bush. This is hard country for a lone woman. I was fond of Thomas in my way, and I'd hate to see his dream fall into the wrong hands, or worse, see you and the boy starve or freeze out here." "What are you proposing, Mr. Blackwood?" Abigail asked, her grip tightening on the Colt. "I'm proposing a kindness," he said, his eyes glinting. Your claim as it stands is probably worthless after this. You've lost your stock, your main means of proving up. The land itself, it's adjacent to my grazing lands. For Thomas's sake and for yours and the boys', I'd be willing to take it off your hands. Offer you a fair price. Enough to get you and the boy back east, or to Laramie where you can find safer work, a new start. A fair price, Abigail echoed, suspicion hardening her voice. And what would you consider fair, Mr. Blackwood, for my husband's dream? For the roof over my son's head? He named a sum. It was insultingly low, barely enough to cover the cost of the lumber in their cabin, let alone the land itself, the years of work they'd poured into it. That's not a price, Mr. Blackwood, Abigail said quietly. Her eyes narrowed. That's charity laced with opportunism. One of Blackwood's men shifted in his saddle, his hand moving closer to his rifle. Blackwood raised a placating hand, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. Now, Mrs. Thorne, no need for harsh words. It's a practical offer given your circumstances. This land will be snowed in again before long. You have a child to think of. How will you feed him? Keep him warm. What happens when the next blizzard hits and you're out here all alone? His words were barbs, each one designed to pierce her already wounded spirit, to highlight her vulnerability. He was preying on her grief, her fear. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Blackwood, Abigail said, her voice laced with ice. But this is my home. My husband died for this land. I won't be scared of it. Blackwood's expression hardened, the thin veneer of civility cracking. Think carefully, Mrs. Thorne. This is a generous offer, born of neighborly concern. It won't remain on the table indefinitely. This land is of no use to a widow who can't work it. It's of use to me. He gestured vaguely to the vast, snow-covered plains around them. It all should be Blackwood land by rights. By what right? Abigail challenged. The right of greed, the right of intimidation. A muscle twitched in Blackwood's jaw. I'm trying to help you, woman. Don't be a fool. You have 1 week. 1 week to gather your personals and be ready to sign the deed over. My man Jeb here. He nodded to the grimmer of his 2 companions. We'll come by with the paperwork and the cash. If you're sensible, you'll take it. If not, he let the threat hang unspoken but palpable. He turned, swung himself back into the saddle with a grunt. His men, who had watched the exchange with stony faces, straightened up. 1 week, Mrs. Thorne, Blackwood repeated, his voice flat and cold as the wind. For your boy's sake, I hope you make the wise choice. The days following Silas Blackwood's visit were a torment for Abigail. His ultimatum 1 week echoed in the frozen silence, each tick of the battered clock on the mantelpiece a countdown to potential ruin. The small measure of relief she'd felt at surviving the blizzard was now overshadowed by this new human threat. How could she, a grieving widow with a young child, stand against a man like Blackwood, who had wealth men and an utter lack of scruples? She tried to be practical. She rationed their food even more strictly. She spent hours clearing more snow, trying to assess the full damage to their small outbuildings, her mind racing with impossible plans. Could she somehow acquire new livestock before spring? Could she find help in Laramie? But Laramie was a multi-day trek through treacherous, snow-filled country, a journey too perilous to undertake with Sammy, especially with the threat of more winter storms. Despair was a constant, unwelcome companion. She found herself talking to Thomas, her voice a low murmur in the empty cabin, seeking his guidance, his strength. She'd look at Sammy, his innocent face shadowed by a grief too large for his young shoulders, and her resolve would harden only to crumble again under the sheer weight of her predicament. The strange tracks she'd seen earlier returned, or perhaps new ones appeared. Always at the periphery, always just out of clear sight. Sometimes she'd catch a flicker of movement in the distance, a shape that blended almost perfectly with the snow and shadows of the sparse, skeletal trees lining the frozen creek bed not far from their cabin. An animal, perhaps a wolf or a coyote drawn by the scent of their meager existence, or something else. The unease settled deeper, a primal fear of the unknown adding to her known anxieties. One particularly bitter afternoon, 3 days after Blackwood's visit, Abigail was outside attempting to secure a loose shutter that was banging relentlessly in the biting wind. Sammy was inside, tasked with keeping the fire fed with small pieces of kindling. The sky was a low, oppressive grey, promising more snow. Her fingers were numb, her spirit lower than the temperature. The task felt symbolic of her struggle, trying to hold together a life that was falling apart. Suddenly, a gust of wind, stronger than the others, whipped around the corner of the cabin, carrying with it a flurry of fresh snow, a miniature blizzard that momentarily blinded her. When her vision cleared, he was there. Standing not 20 feet away near the edge of the tree line was a man. He was tall and lean, cloaked in what looked like pale smoked buckskins and furs that made him almost indistinguishable from the snow-dusted landscape. His face, framed by long, dark hair, was weathered aquiline, his expression unreadable. He carried a bow, not a rifle, and a quiver of arrows on his back. He stood perfectly still like a statue carved from ice and shadow, his dark eyes fixed on her. He made no sound, no threatening gesture. Yet his sudden silent appearance sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Abigail. This was no drifter. This was the source of the tracks, the flicker of movement she'd sensed. Her hand instinctively went to her apron pocket, where she'd taken to carrying Thomas's smaller, single-shot Derringer, the Colt Peacemaker, being too cumbersome for constant wear. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice raspy, trying to inject a firmness she didn't feel. "What do you want?" The man didn't respond. He simply watched her, his gaze intense, unnervingly perceptive. He wasn't looking at her with malice, or so it seemed, but with a quiet, profound scrutiny, as if he were reading her very soul. The silence stretched, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind and the frantic thumping of Abigail's own heart. Was he Crow Cheyenne? His attire was practical native, but not specific enough for her untrained eye to identify a tribe. He was an enigma, a silent warrior materialized from the white fog of the plains. She thought of Blackwood. Could this man be one of his sent to intimidate her further? But his solitary presence, his lack of overt aggression, didn't fit Blackwood's crude style. "If you're here to cause trouble," she said, trying again, her voice trembling slightly, "you should know I'm armed." Still, he remained silent, his posture relaxed yet alert. He shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, and his gaze flickered towards the cabin, then back to her. It was a subtle movement, but it spoke volumes. He knew about Sammy. Fear warred with a strange sort of curiosity within Abigail. He could have attacked her already, if that was his intention. He could have approached unseen under cover of darkness. Instead, he revealed himself in the pale light of day, a direct if silent announcement of his presence. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he moved. Not towards her, but sideways, his steps fluid and utterly silent on the snow. He reached down, and when he straightened, he held up a rabbit, freshly killed, its fur dark against the white. He took a few steps closer to a large flat rock that jutted out from a snowdrift, a landmark near where her pathetic woodpile stood. He laid the rabbit on the rock. Then he met her eyes one last time. A brief, unreadable glance before turning and melting back into the trees and the swirling snowdrift from whence he came, disappearing as silently and completely as a whisper in the wind. Abigail stood frozen, staring at the rabbit on the rock. It was a gift, a peace offering, or something more. Her mind reeled. Who was this man? Why was he watching her, and why, after days of silent observation, had he chosen this moment to reveal himself and to offer aid? The appearance of the silent warrior and his strange gift threw Abigail's already chaotic world into further disarray. She brought the rabbit inside her mind, a whirl of questions. Sammy, seeing the fresh meat, looked up with a spark of interest he hadn't shown in days. "Who gave it to you, Mama?" he asked. A hunter, Sammy," she replied, reluctant to frighten him with the full truth of the man's mysterious appearance. A kind man passing through. But she knew it was more than that. The man hadn't been passing through. He was here somewhere in the vast, snow-choked wilderness that surrounded their isolated homestead, watching. Over the next 2 days, the pattern continued. Each morning, she would find a small offering left on the flat rock. Another rabbit, a brace of ptarmigan once, even a small piece of dried venison, tough but incredibly precious. He never showed himself. There were only the fresh tracks in the snow leading to the rock, and then away, disappearing into the wilderness. He was a ghost, a provider from the white ether. Abigail was torn. Part of her was terrified. This man knew their vulnerability, their isolation. Yet his actions were not hostile. They were supportive. He was helping them survive. With Blackwood's deadline looming, only 2 days now remained of his 1 week. The fresh game was a godsend, stretching their meager supplies, giving her a sliver more strength. She began to leave small things in return on the rock, a piece of her cornbread, a few dried apples from their dwindling store. They always disappeared. An unspoken, fragile barter system developed between the grieving widow and the silent figure in the snow. The day before Blackwood's man Jeb was due to arrive, the warrior revealed himself again. Abigail was struggling to rehang the heavy cabin door, which had come partially off one of its leather hinges during a particularly violent gust of wind the night before. It was an awkward, heavy job for one person, and she was close to tears of frustration, her shoulder aching, the cold biting at her exposed hands. Suddenly she felt a presence. She looked up, startled, her hand instinctively reaching for the derringer in her apron. He stood there near the woodpile, silent as ever. He watched her struggle for a moment, his dark eyes taking in the sagging door, her flushed face, her trembling hands. Then, without a word, he moved forward. Abigail froze, her heart pounding. He was closer now than he'd ever been, close enough for her to see the fine stitching on his buckskin tunic, the way his breath misted in the frigid air, the faint, almost imperceptible scars that marked his weathered cheekbones. He exuded an aura of quiet capability, of a life lived in harmony with the harshness of this land. He gestured towards the door, a simple questioning tilt of his head. Swallowing her fear, Abigail nodded mutely. What choice did she have? He approached the door, examined the broken hinge with a keen eye. Then, with surprising strength and deftness, he lifted the heavy door, maneuvered it back into place. his movements economical and precise. He indicated for her to hold it steady, which she did, her fingers brushing against his fur-lined glove. A strange current, not unpleasant, passed between them at the brief contact. He then produced a strip of cured hide from a pouch at his belt, and using a sharp bone awl, quickly and efficiently repaired the broken hinge, lashing it tighter and more securely than it had been before. The whole process took mere minutes. When he was done, the door hung straight and true. He stepped back, giving the door a gentle push. It swung smoothly. He looked at Abigail, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Satisfaction, or was it a question? "Thank you," she whispered the words, feeling inadequate. I don't know how to repay you." He simply shook his head once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. He then pointed towards the distant snow-covered hills in the direction Blackwood's ranch lay, then made a fist, a gesture of grim finality, before tapping his chest twice. His meaning, though unspoken, was chillingly clear. The threat from that direction was still very real, and he was aware of it. Before she could respond, before she could ask the myriad questions swirling in her mind. "Who are you? Why are you helping me? Do you know Blackwood?" There was a shout from the distance. "Hello, the cabin, Mrs. Thorne." Abigail's blood ran cold. Jeb. Blackwood's man. He was early. The silent warrior's head snapped up, his body instantly tensing, becoming a coiled spring of readiness. His eyes, which had softened almost imperceptibly during their brief interaction, now hardened into chips of flint. He gave Abigail one last swift look. Then, with a speed that belied his calm demeanor, he vanished around the side of the cabin, melting into the shadows and snowdrifts as if he were a part of them. A moment later, two riders emerged from the gentle swell of the plains. It was Jeb Blackwood's grim-faced foreman and another of Blackwood's hired guns. Jeb had a roll of papers tucked into his saddlebag. He surveyed the cabin with a cold, appraising stare. "Mrs. Thorne," Jeb said, his voice devoid of warmth. He didn't dismount. "Mr. Blackwood sent me. You had your week. I trust you've come to a sensible decision." His gaze fell upon the newly repaired door, lingering a fraction of a second too long. A flicker of surprise or perhaps suspicion in his eyes before his stony mask returned. Abigail stood taller, her earlier fear momentarily pushed aside by a surge of defiance, fueled perhaps by the silent warrior's unexpected support. She thought of the fresh meat, the mended door, the silent promise of an ally she didn't understand, but was undeniably present. "I have Mr. Jebediah," Abigail said, her voice clear and cold despite the tremor in her hands. "I've made my decision." Jeb raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. "And that is," Abigail took a deep breath, "this land is not for sale." The smirk vanished from Jeb's face. His eyes narrowed. "Mr. Blackwood ain't gonna like that, ma'am. He ain't gonna like that one bit. He don't take kindly to being defied." "Mr. Blackwood's disposition is not my concern," Abigail stated, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "This is my land. My husband's grave is here now. We are not leaving." Jeb exchanged a look with his companion. "Brave words, little lady. Foolish ones, too. Blackwood gets what he wants, one way or another." He patted the papers in his saddlebag. "I'll be back, and when I am, you'll either sign or you'll be made to wish you had. You and the boy." The threat was blatant, brutal. He wheeled his horse, his companion following suit. As they rode away, Jeb spat onto the pristine snow near Abigail's porch, a gesture of contempt. Abigail watched them go, trembling not just from the cold, but from the confrontation. She had defied Blackwood. The consequences would surely be severe. But as she turned to go back inside, her gaze fell upon a barely perceptible disturbance in the snow near the tree line, a faint track already being softened by the wind. The twist was like a punch to Abigail's gut. This silent warrior, this enigmatic helper, wasn't just a random kind stranger. He had a profound personal connection to this very land, a connection far deeper than her own, deeper even than Blackwood's avarice. Her small homestead, innocently claimed under the law of the white man, was part of a larger stolen legacy. Blackwood. Abigail breathed. Did he drive your people from here? The warrior's eyes, when they met hers again, were burning with a cold fire. He came with papers from the East soldiers at his back. He claimed the water rights fenced the best grazing. Our people were pushed further and further onto barren lands or forced into the reservations to starve slowly. Some resisted. They were silenced. The word silenced carried a chilling finality. My family, he continued, his voice dropping lower, refused to leave this valley. They tried to live as they always had, away from the new settlements. Blackwood saw them as a nuisance, trespassers on his land. He paused, the silence stretching heavy with unspoken grief. One winter like this one, but many snows ago. His men came. There was a fire. Few survived. I was a boy. I watched from the hills hidden in the snow. I saw everything. Abigail felt a wave of horror and a profound aching sympathy. His silence, his watchfulness, his knowledge of the land, it all made a terrible kind of sense now. He wasn't just a warrior. He was a survivor, a guardian of a lost heritage, a silent witness to unspeakable crimes. And you stayed, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. All this time, this land holds my heart, he said simply. I am its memory. I watch. I wait. Men like Blackwood, they believe they own the earth, but the earth owns them. It remembers every injustice. Suddenly his presence, his help took on a new dimension. He wasn't just helping her, Abigail Thorne, the widow. He was protecting this small piece of land. Perhaps the last piece not yet fully consumed by Blackwood's shadow from falling into the hands of the man who had destroyed his world. Her fight had unwittingly become his fight, or perhaps his fight had found an unlikely, unknowing ally in her. Why did you help me? She asked the question that had plagued her for days. After what my kind, what people like me, settlers, have done to your people. He looked at her then, a long, searching gaze. You grieve for your dead, he said slowly. You fight for your child. You do not have the mark of greed in your eyes like Blackwood. You honor the land even in your small way. And his gaze flickered towards her cabin. The boy. He is innocent. No child should see their home burn. The shared pain of loss, of fighting for family, transcended the deep divides of their backgrounds. Abigail felt tears prick her eyes. His name is Sammy. My husband was Thomas. She offered her name in return, a fragile bridge across the chasm of history and hurt. I am Abigail. He nodded slowly. I am Tala, he said, finally giving her his name. It meant wolf in one of the old tongues, a fitting name for a solitary guardian of the wilderness. The revelation of Tala's past, his deep connection to the land she now called home, and his vendetta against Blackwood, changed everything. This was no longer just a struggle for survival or a widow's desperate bid to keep her homestead. It was part of a larger, older story, a tale of injustice, resilience, and the enduring memory of the land itself. And Silas Blackwood was not just a greedy rancher. He was a man with blood on his hands, a man who had built his empire on the ashes of another's. The air grew colder, the days shorter. The week Blackwood had given Abigail was long past, but she knew his silence was not forgiveness. It was the calm before a storm, a different kind of storm than the one that had taken Thomas. This one would be man-made, fueled by greed and cruelty. Tala remained an elusive presence, leaving his usual gifts. But Abigail sensed a change in his watchfulness, an added intensity, a readiness. He was no longer just observing. He was preparing. He began to subtly guide her too. One morning, she found a freshly cut, sturdy staff of ash wood leaning against her door, its tip hardened in fire. Another time, a small, intricately woven snare, perfect for catching small game, was left with a silent lesson in its construction. He was teaching her in his quiet way to be more self-reliant, to see the resources the land offered, resources that went beyond a rifle and a plow. He was sharpening her senses, her will, to survive, preparing her for the inevitable. The reckoning came on a grey, wind-swept morning, exactly 2 weeks after Jeb's last visit. Abigail was splitting kindling, the rhythmic thud of her axe, a small defiance against the oppressive silence, when she heard the distinct sound of multiple horses approaching, not from the main trail, but cutting across the open plain from the direction of Blackwood's ranch. She dropped the axe, her heart leaping into her throat. "Sammy!" she called, rushing inside. "Get under the bed, and don't come out no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" Sammy, his eyes wide with fear, scrambled to obey. Abigail grabbed the Colt Peacemaker, her hands surprisingly steady now. She took a deep breath, thinking of Thomas of Tala's story, of the injustice that bound their fates. This was it. She stepped onto the porch just as Blackwood himself, flanked by Jeb and 4 other grim-faced riders, reined in their horses. They fanned out a clear show of force, their expressions hard and uncompromising. "Mrs. Thorne," Blackwood said, his voice like gravel. "I see you're still here. I had hoped you'd have come to your senses. My patience has run out." "This is my home, Mr. Blackwood," Abigail said, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. The heavy Colt was in her hand, pointed downwards, but visible. "I told your man it's not for sale." Blackwood chuckled a mirthless sound. "Everything's for sale, Mrs. Thorne, or it can be taken. I have the legal papers here." He patted his coat pocket, "attesting to your abandonment of this claim, due to hardship and inability to meet the Homestead Act requirements. A judge in Laramie, a good friend of mine, has already provisionally signed off. All it needs is my statement that the claim is indeed deserted or unworkable." "This claim is neither deserted nor unworkable," Abigail retorted, her anger rising. "You're a liar and a thief." Blackwood's face darkened. "Strong words for a woman in your position. Jeb, perhaps you and the boys can persuade Mrs. Thorne to vacate the premises. She can take her boy and whatever she can carry on her back. The rest belongs to me now." Jeb and 2 other men dismounted, their intentions clear. They began to advance on the cabin. "Stay back," Abigail warned, raising the Colt, her finger tightening on the trigger. "I will defend my home," Jeb sneered. "With that against all of us, don't be a fool, woman." Suddenly, an arrow hissed through the air, burying itself deep into the porch post, inches from Jeb's head. He yelped, jumping back, his hand flying to his own pistol. Blackwood and his other men swore, spinning their horses, trying to locate the archer. Tala stepped out from the dense thicket of willows down by the frozen creek bed, another arrow already nocked in his bow. He was a figure of cold fury, his eyes blazing, his stance perfectly balanced. "Blackwood," Tala's voice, though not loud, cut through the tension like a knife. "This land does not belong to you." Blackwood stared momentarily, stunned. "Who in the blazes are you? Another squatter? Or just some half-breed troublemaker?" "He is a friend," Abigail declared, finding courage in Tala's sudden dramatic appearance. "And he knows your crimes, Blackwood. He knows what you did to his people on this very land." Blackwood's face, already florid, seemed to pale slightly. His eyes darted towards the ancient cottonwoods Tala had pointed out to Abigail. A flicker of something, fear recognition, crossed his features. "Lies, Indian superstitions," he blustered. "This is my land. I have the papers. Your papers are written in blood." Tala stated, his arrow still aimed steadily at Blackwood's chest. "Kill him!" Blackwood shrieked to his men. "And the woman, too, if she interferes. Burn the cabin. I want this land cleared." Jeb, recovering his nerve, drew his pistol and fired wildly towards Tala. The shot went wide, kicking up snow. 2 other men raised their rifles. Blackwood, enraged and perhaps a little panicked, spurred his horse towards the cabin, drawing his own revolver. "I'll deal with you myself, you stubborn witch." Abigail stood her ground, desperately trying to reload the Colt, her fingers fumbling with the cartridges. She wouldn't make it in time. Blackwood was almost upon her, his face a mask of fury, his pistol leveled. Just as he was about to fire, a dark shape hurtled from the side of the cabin, the staff Tala had left for her. It wasn't Tala himself, but Abigail realized he must have anticipated Blackwood's move, leaving it there for her. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, she dropped the Colt and snatched up the staff, swinging it with all her might. The fire-hardened tip connected with Blackwood's gun hand. There was a sickening crack of bone, and his pistol flew from his grasp, landing yards away. Blackwood screamed in agony, clutching his shattered hand, his horse rearing in fright. Before he could recover, Tala was there, emerging silently from behind the woodpile. He seized Blackwood's reins, his face inches from the rancher's. "This is not your land, Blackwood," Tala said, his voice low and deadly. "It never was. It remembers, and so do I." The remaining 2 riders, seeing their leader disarmed and at Tala's mercy, and with Jeb and 2 others wounded, lost their nerve. They exchanged a look, then wheeled their horses and fled, not even bothering to help their fallen comrades. Blackwood, his face contorted with pain and rage, spat at Tala. "You'll hang for this savage, all of you." Tala simply looked at him with cold contempt. He then turned to Abigail. "The choice is yours, Abigail Thorne. What is to be done with him?" Abigail looked at Blackwood, a broken, pathetic figure, despite his earlier bluster. She thought of Thomas, of the life they had built, of the terror Blackwood had inflicted. Then she looked at Tala, his face grim but resolute. Revenge would be sweet, but it wouldn't bring Thomas back. It wouldn't undo the past. "He'll face justice," Abigail said, her voice firm. "Not vigilante justice, Tala, but the law. What little of it reaches out here. We'll take him and Jeb to Laramie. We'll tell Marshal Brody what happened here. About his illegal claim, his threats, his attack." She looked pointedly at Tala. "And about the other crimes this land remembers. Perhaps it's time those memories were given a voice." Tala studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "It is a difficult path. The white man's law is not always just for my kind, or for yours when men like Blackwood hold sway. "But it's the only path we have if we want to build something lasting," Abigail replied. "Something other than an endless cycle of violence." Tala looked at the wounded Jeb, then at the disarmed and whimpering Blackwood. "Then we will take them." The reckoning had come. Not with the fiery consummation Blackwood had intended, but with a surprising turn of resilience, an unexpected alliance, and the quiet, enduring memory of the land itself rising up to claim a measure of justice. The journey to Laramie was harsh and fraught with tension. Abigail, with Tala's stoic help, managed to bind Jeb's leg and Blackwood's shattered hand. They loaded the two wounded men, sullen and cursing, onto their own horses. Abigail rode Thomas's old mare, Betsy, who had miraculously survived the blizzard by finding shelter in a deep ravine, returning to the cabin a few days after the storm, thin but alive. A small, poignant miracle. Tala, ever watchful, scouted ahead or flanked their small procession, his presence a silent deterrent to any further trouble. Sammy, bundled securely, rode with Abigail, his earlier fear replaced by a wide-eyed awe of the silent warrior who had helped his mother. The legal battle would be long and arduous, Abigail knew. Blackwood was rich and had connections, but a seed had been planted. The vulture's wings had been clipped, at least for now. Abigail and Sammy stayed in Laramie for several weeks, boarding with a kind pastor's family. Abigail gave her formal testimony. Tala, after ensuring she was safe and her story heard, slipped away one night, as silently as he had arrived in her life. He left no word, no trace, only a single eagle feather, placed carefully on the windowsill of Abigail's room. A farewell, a blessing. With Blackwood detained and his empire under scrutiny, Abigail found she could finally breathe. The immediate threat to her homestead was lifted. Kind folks in Laramie, hearing of her plight and her bravery, offered help. Some men volunteered to ride out to her claim, help her bury Thomas properly, and make essential repairs to the cabin and outbuildings, preparing for the true spring thaw. She returned to her land, a changed woman. The grief for Thomas was still a raw ache, but it was now interwoven with a fierce strength she hadn't known she possessed. The plains no longer seemed empty or solely menacing. They held memories, yes, of sorrow, but also of incredible courage, of an unlikely friendship, and of the land's own enduring spirit. She never saw Tala again. Sometimes in the quiet evenings, as she sat on her porch watching Sammy play, where his father once had, she would look out towards the ancient cottonwoods by the creek and feel a sense of his presence, a lingering silence that was comforting rather than empty. She knew he was out there, a guardian spirit of the wilderness, a memory keeper. Abigail Thorne never forgot the lessons of that terrible winter, nor the silent warrior named Tala, who taught her that even in the deepest snows of despair, courage can take root. Her life was a testament to resilience, a story whispered on the Wyoming winds. Silas Blackwood eventually faced a measure of justice, his empire crumbling under the weight of his own greed, and the truths finally brought to light. Tala. He remained a part of the land, a whisper in the cottonwoods, a protector of its sacred memories. Abigail's story reminds us that even when the blizzards of life strip everything away, new paths can be forged, unexpected allies can appear, and the human spirit can endure and even flourish. What did you think of Abigail's incredible journey and the mysterious Tala? Let us know in the comments below. If this tale of survival courage and the untamed West moved you, please give this video a like, share it with someone who loves a gripping story, and don't forget to subscribe for more epic narratives from the annals of history and legend. Click click that notification bell so you don't miss our next adventure into the past.